Hey, everyone. Welcome back to the channel. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button. It takes 1 second, and it really helps this small channel grow. Now, let's get into it. Picture a desk in Berlin. The year is 1940. A man leans over a thick folder. Inside, there are maps, charts, and numbers, millions of them. Each number is a person. Each person is a problem to be solved. And the solution on that desk is the quietest kind of horror, a plan on paper. Now here's a saying that Germans sometimes use, and it's painfully fitting for this story. Papier ist geduldig. Paper is patient. It will hold anything you write on it, including the deaths of 30 million human beings. This is the story of General Plan Ost. Not a battle, not a weapon, a blueprint. Hitler didn't just want to invade the Soviet Union. He wanted to rewrite the map of Eastern Europe, not with flags, but with empty space. His vision, laid out in Mein Kampf back in 1925 and expanded in his so-called second book in 1928, was simple and savage. Germany needed Lebensraum, living room, and that living room stretched from the forests of Poland all the way to the Ural Mountains. Who lived there? In Hitler's mind, the wrong people. And wrong people, in his vocabulary, meant tens of millions of Slavs, Jews, Roma, and anyone else he considered racially inferior. The blueprint itself had a bureaucratic name, General Plan Ost, General Plan for the East. It was drafted between 1939 and 1940 by the Reich Main Security Office, the RSHA, which was run by Reinhard Heydrich, one of the most dangerous bureaucrats of the 20th century. Other names attached to the project include Alfred Rosenberg, the Reich Minister for the occupied Eastern Territories, and Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, who obsessed over questions of race and settlement the way other men obsess over football scores. Here's the part most people don't realize. The plan was already finished before the first German soldier crossed the Soviet border in June 1941. The invasion didn't start the killing. The paperwork did. So what did the plan actually say? Let's look at the numbers, because the numbers are where the horror lives. The territory Hitler and his planners had their eyes on stretched across Poland, the Baltic states, Belarus, Ukraine, and the western parts of Russia itself, a slab of land holding roughly 45 million people. Of those 45 million, about 31 million were marked for what the documents chillingly called removal, evacuation, or reduction. The remaining 14 million were sorted into categories, some marked for forced labor, some for slow Germanization, a handful judged racially valuable enough to be absorbed into the Reich. 3 categories, 3 different kinds of death, dressed up in office language. The first category was starvation. Not famine as a side effect, starvation as a deliberate policy. A man named Herbert Back, who served as state secretary in the Reich Ministry of Agriculture, drafted what historians now call the Hunger Plan. The idea was brutally simple. Seal off the cities, cut off the food supply, and let the population collapse. The grain that wasn't eaten by the locals would flow west to Germany and to the German army. The Soviet cities were returned into what one planner called death zones, places where people simply ceased to exist. The second category was forced migration. Millions were to be herded east of the Urals, into Siberia, into lands that even the planners admitted couldn't support them. The journey itself was designed to kill. No transport, no shelter, no food, just movement and then silence. The third category was direct liquidation. Special units, mobile killing squads would handle the rest. But we'll get to those in the next part of the series. For now, just understand, the planners weren't vague. They had spreadsheets. They had timelines. They had settler quotas for German families, 4.5 million of them, projected over 25 years, settled on a land that had been freed of its original inhabitants. Here's a detail that often gets overlooked. The Nazis had dress rehearsals. In October 1939, ethnic Germans, Volksdeutsch, were resettled from the Baltic states and from Bessarabia into annexed Polish territory. A year later, in 1940, more Volksdeutsch were moved out of the Lublin region. These smaller operations were treated as practice runs. Think of them as pilot episodes for a horror show that nobody asked for. And the men behind the plan? They weren't raving lunatics hiding in bunkers. They were ministers, lawyers, economists, agricultural scientists. Rosenberg wrote memoranda. Back wrote memos on caloric intake. Himmler wrote about racial selectors who would travel ahead of the settlers and decide, with a glance, who deserved to live. Hans Frank, the governor-general of occupied Poland, said the quiet part out loud in 1940. "We must annihilate the Poles," he told his staff. Yes, he used the word annihilate in a government meeting. On the record, there's a reason historians call General Plan the most extensive demographic engineering scheme ever attempted by a modern state. It wasn't a war crime in the heat of battle. It was a project with phases, with budgets, with review meetings. The paper was patient. The paper waited years. And when the time came, the paper turned into bodies. Now, here's something that matters. When the war ended in 1945, most of the General Plan Ost documents were destroyed. The SS burned what they could in the final months of the conflict. But fragments survived, pulled out of the wreckage by American soldiers who knew what they were looking at. Those fragments ended up in the U.S. National Archives in Maryland and in the Federal Archives in Berlin. They were used at Nuremberg. They're still used today. And that's where we'll pick up next time. How a plan on paper became a machine of ghettos, deportations, and death. But before we go, a quick reminder. If this kind of deep dive history resonates with you, consider subscribing. It genuinely helps us keep making these long-form stories. See you in the next one. Hey, everyone. Welcome back. In the last episode, we walked through the blueprint, the desk in Berlin, the maps, the numbers, the 31 million people marked for removal. Now we need to ask the harder question. What happens when paper meets ground? What does a plan on paper actually look like when the soldiers arrive, when the cities are taken, when the trains start running? The answer is uglier than the documents. Because the documents were tidy. The reality was a machine. And like every machine, it had gears, and each gear had a name. Let's start with the men who turned policy into practice. Because here's the thing about Nazi bureaucracy. It had specialists. Lots of them. And the specialists competing with each other to out-radicalize their colleagues. In the Warthegau, the western half of occupied Poland, annexed directly into the Reich, a man named Arthur Greiser ran things as Reich Commissar. In Ukraine, another man named Erich Koch held the same title. Both were competing in their own twisted way to prove their loyalty to the racial vision. They didn't wait for orders from Berlin. They improvised. They pushed. They gave speeches that would later be used against them in court. Greiser, in a 1941 address, told his administrators that the Warthegau would be German in 10 years. Germanized, cultivated, and cleared. Koch, in a speech in Posen in February 1943, said something even more chilling. He told his audience that when the war ended, the region should be emptied of everyone. From this area, no human being should ever emerge alive. Yes, a sitting governor, on the record, saying that out loud. But the men who gave the speeches were not the ones who did the killing. The killing had its own specialists, and they were mobile. Behind the German army, but not part of it. For Einsatzgruppen roamed the occupied Soviet territories. Einsatzgruppen simply means operational groups, but the word does not capture what they did. Group A moved north into the Baltic states and toward Leningrad. Group B moved through Belarus. Group C moved toward Kiev and the south. Group D moved into the Crimea and the Caucasus. Their job was to follow the front lines, round up civilians, and shoot them. The reports these units filed back to Berlin are probably the most disturbing bureaucratic documents of the 20th century. They're called the Erinnerungsmeldungen UdSSR, operational situation reports from the Soviet Union. They read like accounting ledgers. Day after day, the numbers pile up. On such and such date, in such and such location, a number of people were executed. Thousands of them. Tens of thousands. The language is dead. The verbs are calm. The numbers keep growing. In total, the 4 Einsatzgruppen and their affiliated units murdered somewhere around 1.5 million people, mostly Jewish civilians, but also Roma, Soviet prisoners of war, and communist officials. By the time the war ended, only a handful of men from these units had ever been held accountable. Now, a single event stands out, even inside this ocean of killing, because it was the largest single massacre of the entire war, and it happened in 2 days. On the 29th and 30th of September, 1941, in a ravine called Babi Yar on the outskirts of Kiev, a German special unit, Sonderkommando 4A, under the command of a man named Paul Blobel, murdered approximately 33,771 Jewish civilians. In 2 days, 29,740 on the first day, the rest on the second. How do you murder that many people in 48 hours? The logistics are horrifying to follow, but they were in fact logistics. Jews in Kiev had been ordered to assemble at a specific location, told they were being resettled. They brought their documents. They brought their children. They brought their suitcases. They were marched in groups to the ravine, forced to undress, told to lie down in rows, and then shot. The bodies fell into the ravine. The next group was ordered forward. The next group undressed. The next group lay down. Other sites followed the same logic. Ponary, near Vilnius. Rumbula, outside Riga. The 9th Fort of Kaunas. The Mali Trostanet site, near Minsk. Different locations. Same arithmetic. But here's what people often miss. The Einsatzgruppen were not the most efficient killing technology of the war. By 1942, the Nazi leadership had decided that squads of men shooting individual civilians was slow, psychologically difficult, and bad for the morale of the soldiers. So they industrialized the process. The Holocaust's most infamous chapter, the death camps, was a response to the inefficiency of manual mass murder. The engineers built faster machines. The machine at Auschwitz could process more people in a day than the Einsatzgruppen could shoot in a week. Now, while the special units were shooting, the regular German army was also killing. And this is important because it breaks the myth that the Wehrmacht was a clean, apolitical institution. It wasn't. In June 1941, the German High Command issued an order, the Kommissar Order, instructing soldiers that captured Soviet political officers were to be executed on the spot, not as prisoners of war, not as combatants, as a class of people designated for death. A few days later, the Barbarossa Decree stripped German soldiers of legal accountability for crimes committed against Soviet civilians. Then came the Guidelines for the Conduct of the Troops in Russia, a document that essentially told every soldier that the war in the East was a war of extermination, and that anything was permitted. This is not rumor. These documents were captured, translated, and entered into the Nuremberg trial record. They were written by lawyers, signed by generals, distributed down the chain of command. They were orders, and the soldiers followed them. By the end of the war, the Germans had captured around 5,700,000 Soviet soldiers. Of those, approximately 3,300,000 died in captivity. Let that number settle. 3.3 million. That's 57% of all Soviet prisoners taken. In American, British, or French captivity, the death rate of prisoners of war was typically below 5%. The German rate was so high because the food was deliberately withheld, the medical care was deliberately minimal, and the prisoners were deliberately worked to death. The hunger plan didn't only apply to civilians. It applied to the men in the cages. Now, the civilian side of the occupation was even more revealing, because here the bureaucracy really showed itself. In Warsaw, Hans Frank, the man who said he would annihilate the Poles, controlled the general government, the part of Poland that wasn't directly annexed. In 1941, Frank's administration set the daily food ration for Jews in Warsaw at 261 calories. 261. A moderately active adult needs around 2,000. The elderly, the children, the sick, they were being allocated a tenth of what their bodies needed to survive. Frank knew this. He said in a cabinet meeting that he was prepared to let the Jews starve. He said it calmly. He said it as a matter of policy. In Lodz, the ghetto became a forced labor reservoir. People were not killed immediately, they were used. They were used for German industry, for German agriculture, for German construction. When they could no longer work, they were killed. That was the economic logic of the occupation in one sentence. Work them until they break, then dispose of them. In Leningrad, the plan was even more explicit. The siege of the city began on the 8th of September, 1941, and lasted 872 days. Almost 900 days of deliberate starvation. The Germans planned to take the city. When they failed, they decided to let it die. Bomb the food warehouses. Destroy the supply routes. Wait. The result was that approximately 1,100,000 civilians perished. Not from bullets, not from gas, but from hunger. Leningrad was a laboratory. The planners were watching. They were taking notes on how fast populations collapse when food is removed. Now, here's a detail that catches a lot of people off guard. The Nazi planners were students of recent history. They knew about the Ukrainian famine of 1932 and 1933, the Holodomor, and they studied it. They studied the methods. They studied how the Soviet government had extracted grain from the Ukrainian countryside regardless of the human cost. They took notes. They considered the Holodomor a successful precedent. Stalin had killed millions of Ukrainians through grain quotas. Now the Germans would kill millions more through grain quotas. The modeling was deliberate. The planners called it the Ukrainian experience. They were applying lessons from Moscow's atrocities to Berlin's new campaign. And through all of this, the collaboration of the occupation administration was total. Alfred Rosenberg's Ministry for the Occupied Eastern Territories produced a memorandum in November of 1941 that even racially acceptable Slavs, Ukrainians, Latvians, Lithuanians who were judged somehow worthy of survival, were not to be given citizenship. They would be enslaved. The hierarchy was clear. Germans at the top, useful collaborators below them. Everyone else marked for slow elimination. The machinery was working. The paper had become bodies. The 31 million were not abstract anymore. But there were cracks, and the cracks would become the war's turning point. The failure outside Moscow in December 1941. The disaster at Stalingrad, which began in August 1942 and ended in February 1943. These military defeats didn't end the killing. The machinery kept running until the last days of the war, but they did end the possibility of full implementation. The settler castles planned for the emptied territories were never built. The 25-year Germanization timeline became a fantasy. The 4.5 million family quota became a line in a file in Maryland. In the next episode, we'll look at that other half of the plan, the one most people forget. Because General Plan Ost wasn't only about removing people. It was also about putting people in, the Germanization, the settlers, the grabbing of children, the rewriting of names on cities, the dream of a new Europe with empty fields and German farms, stretching from the Rhine to the Urals. That's where we're headed next. Hey, everyone, welcome back. So far, we've covered the desk, the documents, and the killing machine. Now we need to look at the other half of the equation, the half that most people forget when they hear about General Plan Ost. Because the planners weren't only obsessed with emptying the East, they were equally obsessed with filling it. And the way they wanted to fill it tells you even more about how they saw the future. Here's the basic idea, and it's worth saying out loud. You cannot build a colonial empire by simply removing the people who already live there. At some point, you have to put new people in their place. And those new people need to be the right kind of people, the right race, the right blood, the right number of children. For the Nazi leadership, the settlement of the East was a question as urgent as the removal itself. They called it Heimat's Reich, home to the Reich. The slogan sounds almost gentle, almost like a refugee program. It wasn't. It was a demographic war fought with rail timetables, racial examiners, and confiscated farms. The people being moved into the emptied territories were ethnic Germans, Volksdeutsch, scattered across Eastern Europe for centuries. There were German-speaking communities in the Baltic states, in Bessarabia, in Bukovina, in the Volga region, in the Polish countryside. Some had lived in those places for 200 or 300 years. The Nazi state now decided that these communities were part of the German people, and they had to come home. Home, in this context, meant the newly annexed Polish territories, the Warthegau, Danzig, West Prussia, Upper Silesia. The houses of expelled Poles and murdered Jews became the new addresses of resettled Germans. The numbers were significant. By the end of the war, roughly 630,000 Volksdeutsch had been moved into occupied Poland from the Baltic states, Bessarabia, Bukovina, and other regions. To put that in perspective, that's roughly the population of a mid-sized American city. And it represented only the beginning. The full plan called for relocating millions more over a 25-year horizon. Hitler and Himmler talked about German family settlements the way American suburban developers talk about housing tracts. There were blueprints. There were density targets. The planners calculated that each 1,000 square kilometers of Eastern territory would eventually hold roughly 6.5 Germans per square kilometer. Multiply that across the whole designated zone, and you get a number that sounds like science fiction. Millions of new settlers on land that had been deliberately cleared of its previous inhabitants. And who decided who was German enough to be one of these settlers? That question fell to an office called the RUSHA, the Race and Settlement Main Office. The word sounds harmless, like a housing authority. In practice, it was a racial sorting machine. Officials from the RUSHA traveled to the communities being resettled and examined the candidates. They measured skull shapes. They asked about grandparents. They examined family trees. They assessed eye color, hair color, and general racial appearance. Some applicants were accepted as full Germans. Some were accepted with conditions. Some were rejected outright and left behind to face the same fate as the local populations they had lived among for generations. The resettlement wasn't random. It was organized with the kind of administrative precision that the Nazi state applied to everything. Trains were scheduled. Property was inventoried. Furniture was loaded onto freight cars and shipped west. When the settlers arrived at their new homes, they often found the previous owner's belongings still in place. Dishes in the cupboard, clothes in the wardrobe, photographs on the walls. Some settlers moved into homes where the former occupants had been deported to ghettos just weeks earlier. The continuity was almost theatrical. One family left. Another family arrived. The houses didn't change. The names on the doors did. This brings us to one of the darker corners of the entire plan, the question of children. Because the settlers needed to reproduce. The planners understood that demographic projects take time, and they wanted to compress that time. The answer was a program called Lebensborn, Fountain of Life. Lebensborn was a network of maternity homes where racially valuable women could give birth to children who would be raised as Germans. Some of these women were unmarried. Some were the wives of SS officers. Some were recruited from occupied Norway, where the population was judged to have particularly Nordic blood. The children born in these homes were given to adoptive families, often SS families, and raised as German children. The program was explicit in its eugenic logic. It existed to produce more of the right kind of people faster than nature would normally allow. But Lebensborn was only half the story. There was another program, and it was openly criminal. In occupied Poland, in the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, and eventually in parts of the occupied Soviet Union, SS units identified children who looked Aryan, blue eyes, blonde hair, the right kind of features, and took them from their families. The parents were usually told that the children were being sent to a camp for Germanization through labor. In reality, the children were placed in special facilities where their names were changed, their identities were rewritten, and they were prepared for adoption by German families. The program was run by the same RUSHA office that vetted the settlers. It was bureaucratic kidnapping on an industrial scale. One of the clearest examples of how this system worked in practice came from a region in southeastern Poland called Zamość. In late 1942, Himmler personally ordered the expulsion of roughly 110,000 Polish civilians from the Zamość region. Their farms were to be given to German settlers. Their villages were to be renamed with German titles. Their children were to be separated and Germanized. The operation triggered one of the most significant acts of Polish civilian resistance during the entire war. The Zamość Uprising, as it became known, erupted in late 1942 and continued into early 1943. Polish partisans, local farmers, and even some of the children themselves fought back against the expulsions. The Germans responded with mass arrests and the execution of suspected resistors. By the time the operation was partially rolled back under military pressure, roughly 4,500 children had been taken from their families and placed in Germanization camps. The most notorious of these camps was a facility called Leborn, where Polish children were subjected to racial examinations, language tests, and physical drills designed to erase their Polish identity. Some of these children were eventually recovered by Polish organizations after the war. Others were never returned. Their Polish families searched for them for years, sometimes decades, often without success. The economic logic behind the settlement program was just as radical as the racial logic. The planners envisioned a new agrarian order in the East, a system they called the Neue Agrarordnung. On paper, the order reversed Soviet collectivization. In practice, it simply replaced one form of exploitation with another. Large collective farms were broken up and reorganized into private German farms, each one given to a selected settler family. The land had been confiscated from its previous owners, of course, owners who were now dead, deported, or enslaved. The new farms were supposed to feed the Reich. The German settlers were supposed to be the new peasantry of a continental empire. But the planners didn't stop at agriculture. They had industrial dreams too. Major German corporations, Krupp, IG Farben, the Hermann Göring Werke, were granted enormous concessions in the occupied East. A complex of synthetic rubber plants was built near Auschwitz, using prisoner labor from the camp next door. Iron ore mines in Kryvyi Rih were expanded with forced labor. Coal mines in the Donbass were reopened under German administration. Each of these industrial sites was integrated into the broader demographic plan. They were designed to employ enslaved workers from the surrounding population, produce goods for the German war machine, and reinforce the racial hierarchy that the planners had envisioned from the beginning. The cultural dimension of the Germanization project is often overlooked, but it mattered enormously to the planners. They wanted not only to empty the East and fill it with Germans, but also to erase the cultural memory of the people who had lived there. Slavic place names were to be replaced with German ones. Libraries were to be purged of undesirable literature. Schools were to teach German history and German geography only. Local languages were to be discouraged and eventually eliminated. The planners drew up detailed renaming lists for major cities. Leningrad was to become Petrograd. Kiev was to be renamed. So was Minsk. So was Kharkiv. The goal was a total rewrite of the map, not just of who lived where, but of what those places were called and what they meant. Now, it's important to understand why none of this was ever fully implemented. The planners had the designs. They had the manpower. They had the racial ideology. What they didn't have was time, because the war was going badly. The German failure at the gates of Moscow in December 1941 was the first major crack. The German army had expected to take the Soviet capital in a matter of weeks. When the winter set in and the Soviet counteroffensive began, the entire timeline of Operation Barbarossa collapsed. The planners in Berlin had assumed they would have years to work. Suddenly they had months, maybe less. The disaster at Stalingrad, which began in August 1942 and ended with the German surrender in early February 1943, was the second major crack, and it was even more decisive. After Stalingrad, the German army was on the defensive everywhere. The occupied territories began to slip away, region by region. The settlers who had been installed in the Warthegau started to flee westward as the Red Army advanced. The resettlement program ground to a halt. The settler castles planned for each 1,000 square kilometers of Eastern territory were never built. The 25-year timeline became a fantasy. The 4.5 million family quota became a line in a file in College Park, Maryland, where American soldiers would later find it among the wreckage. But even as the military situation deteriorated, the demographic program didn't simply stop. It mutated. In the final years of the war, with the Eastern Front collapsing, the Nazi leadership shifted its priorities. The remaining Polish population in the Warthegau was subjected to accelerated deportations. Polish children were seized in larger numbers for Germanization. The labor camps were expanded to extract maximum output before the territory was lost. The system kept running until the Red Army was literally at the gates. The Warthegau statistical record from 1943 tells the story in its own brutal arithmetic. That year, roughly 365,000 Poles were forcibly deported from the region. In their place, roughly 92,000 Volksdeutsch settlers were installed, and roughly 78,000 Polish children were cleared, the planner's own word, into forced labor and Germanization camps. Each of those numbers represented human beings who had homes, who had names, who had futures. The paperwork erased all of it. The paper was patient, and the paper was cruel. In the next part of this series, we'll look at what happened after the war, how the documents were hidden, how they were found, and what they tell us about the bureaucratic nature of modern atrocity. We'll meet the lawyers, the planners, the survivors, and the historians who spent decades trying to make sense of what the paper contained. Because the story of General Plan Ost doesn't end when the guns go silent. In some ways, that's where it really begins. The war ended in May of 1945, but the paperwork didn't stop there. It just changed hands, and the men who had written the numbers now had to answer for them. The first courtroom where the architects of General Plan Ost were forced to account for what they had drawn up was Nuremberg. Between November of 1945 and October of 1946, the International Military Tribunal put 24 of the most senior Nazi leaders on trial. 21 of them sat in the dock. Most of them had read the General Plan Ost fragments, or at least knew they existed. Alfred Rosenberg, who had run the ministry for the occupied Eastern Territories, was one of the defendants. He tried to distance himself from the worst of it, claimed he had been a reluctant administrator, claimed he had tried to soften some of the orders. The tribunal didn't buy it. He was convicted on 4 counts, including conspiracy to commit crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. On the 16th of October, 1946, he was hanged. The same fate met 10 of the other defendants. 3 were acquitted. 3 received prison sentences. Hermann Göring cheated the hangman by swallowing cyanide the night before his scheduled execution. But Nuremberg was only the beginning. Between 1946 and 1949, the United States authorities ran a series of 12 additional trials in the same courthouse, under what became known as the subsequent Nuremberg trials. Several of these later proceedings dealt directly with the implementation of General Plan Ost. The Einsatzgruppen trial, which ran from July 1947 to April 1948, was the one that produced the most detailed testimony about the killing machine in the field. 24 defendants stood trial. 14 were death sentences, of which 4 were eventually carried out. The others received various prison terms. The star witness for the prosecution was a man named Otto Ohlendorf, who had commanded Einsatzgruppe. He was a soft-spoken economist, a former official in the German government, a man who wore rimmed glasses and spoke in measured academic sentences. Under oath, he calmly described how his unit had murdered approximately 90,000 people in the course of a single year. He described the procedure in detail. He described the pits. He described the way his men had been encouraged to drink heavily before each operation, because sober men found it harder to shoot women and children at close range. He described it all without raising his voice. The trial record runs for thousands of pages, and it is one of the most disturbing documents ever compiled by a court of law. Ohlendorf was sentenced to death and hanged in June of 1951 at Landsberg Prison. The Ministry's trial, which ran from January 1948 to April 1949, focused on the civilian administrators who had run the occupation. 16 defendants, mostly lawyers and bureaucrats from the Foreign Office, the Rosenberg Ministry, and other Reich agencies. Several of them had signed off on the deportation orders that had emptied the Polish countryside. Several of them had drafted the racial classification schemes that decided who could live and who had to die. The verdicts were mixed. Some were acquitted. Some received prison sentences. A few were convicted and hanged. The Reshaped trial, which ran from October 1947 to March 1948, went after the racial examiners, the men who had decided who was racially valuable enough to be spared, who had organized the kidnapping of Polish children, who had run the Lebensborn homes. 14 defendants, most of them convicted. The presiding judge, a man named Kurt J. Peek, made it clear in his sentencing remarks that the office had been a criminal enterprise from the start, that racial ideology was not science, but murder dressed up in academic language. After these trials, the courtroom work on General Plan Ost largely went quiet for decades. The Cold War had begun, and both the Western Allies and the Soviet Union had other priorities. West Germany rebuilt itself as a democratic state. The archives sat in boxes in College Park in Berlin, in Moscow. Historians picked at the edges of the story, but the full picture didn't begin to emerge until the 1970s and 80s. The turning point came with a Polish historian named Czesław Matodzic. Working from the surviving fragments and from documents held in Polish and German archives, Matodzic spent decades assembling what he called the definitive account of General Plan Ost. He died before he could finish his magnum opus, but the work he had done formed the foundation for almost everything that came after. A young American historian named Meyer Rossmann had published the first comprehensive academic study of Nazi Eastern policy in 1976. A German scholar named Götz Allee picked up the economic side of the story in the 1990s, showing how the hunger plan and the settlement schemes had been financed by the proceeds of robbery and murder. An Israeli scholar named Alex Kay wrote the definitive English-language account of the hunger plan in 2006. And the American historian Timothy Snyder brought the entire arc together in his 2010 book, Bloodlands, which placed the Nazi Eastern killing in the same frame as the Soviet famines and repressions, and gave the English-reading world its clearest picture yet of what had actually happened in the space between Berlin and Moscow between 1933 and 1945. What the historians found, when they dug into the documents, was that the surviving fragments were only a fraction of the whole. The SS had been ordered to destroy General Plan Ost in the final months of the war, and they had largely succeeded. What they hadn't managed to destroy was recovered by a small unit of American soldiers, known as the Paper Pile Team, part of the Office of Military Government, United States. These men, archivists, historians, librarians in uniform, had been instructed to capture German records before they could be burned. They worked in bombed-out government buildings, in salt mines, in flooded basements. They pulled boxes out of rubble. They rode trains full of confiscated documents back to the American zone. The fragments they saved now sit in the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, and in the German Federal Archives in Berlin-Lichterfeld. They are still being read, still being analyzed, still producing new scholarship almost 80 years after the war ended. The numbers, when historians finally put them together, told a story that was even worse than the Nuremberg prosecutors had realized. Of the 31 million people designated for removal in General Plan Ost, approximately 14 million Soviet civilians and prisoners of war actually died through execution, starvation, ghettoization, or forced labor. Approximately 3 million Polish Jews were murdered. 90% of the pre-war Polish Jewish population, the largest Jewish community in the world, almost entirely erased. Several 100,000 Roma were killed across the occupied East. Millions of Soviet prisoners of war died in German captivity, 3.3 million in total, a death rate of 57%, the highest of any national group in any prison system of the war. The arithmetic of the original plan turned out, in many cases, to be a near-perfect prediction of what actually unfolded. But the numbers don't capture the whole story, and the historians knew it. Behind each digit was a name, a village, a language, a tradition, a recipe, a song, a face. The survivors made sure that some of those names survived too. Primo Levi, the Italian Jewish chemist who had been deported to Auschwitz in 1944, spent the rest of his life writing about what he had seen. If This Is a Man Dash, published in Italian in 1947 and in English in 1959, became one of the foundational documents of Holocaust literature. Levi wrote with the precision of a scientist and the grief of a man who had lost almost everyone he knew. He described the arrival at the camp, the selection on the ramp, the slow grinding down of personality, the hunger, the cold, the arbitrary cruelty. He also described the small acts of resistance, the smuggled bread, the whispered word of comfort, the refusal to lose the inner life even when every external support had been taken away. He survived the war. He died in 1987, and the circumstances of his death are still debated. but the books he left behind are still read. Elie Wiesel, the Romanian Jewish writer who had been deported as a teenager to Auschwitz and then to Buchenwald, became the most prominent public voice of Holocaust remembrance in the second half of the 20th century. His novel, Night Dash, first published in Yiddish in 1956 and in English in 1960, told the story of his own deportation, the death of his father, his loss of faith, his survival. He received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1986. He spent decades reminding the world that the bureaucratic machinery of murder had been built by ordinary people with ordinary educations in an ordinary modern state. The point was not that monsters existed. The point was that monsters were made, and that the making was a process that could be studied. Vasily Grossman, the Soviet Jewish journalist and novelist, had been with the Red Army when it liberated Treblinka in the summer of 1944. He wrote a long article about what he found there, called The Hell of Treblinka, which was published in the Soviet literary magazine Znamya in December of that year. It was one of the first detailed accounts of a Nazi extermination camp to reach a wide audience. Grossman went on to write the novel Life and Fate Dash, a vast panorama of the Battle of Stalingrad that contained, almost as a subplot, an entire section on the extermination of the Jews. Soviet censors suppressed the novel for decades. It was finally published in the 1980s and is now considered one of the great works of 20th century literature. Grossman died in 1964, but his manuscript survived, and they continued to give voice to the millions who did not. The trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem in 1961 and Hannah Arendt's controversial coverage of it for The New Yorker Dash brought the bureaucratic nature of the killing back into public consciousness. Arendt's phrase, the banality of evil, though she later regretted it, captured something essential about General Plan Ost. The men who had run the operation had not been raving sadists. They had been functionaries. They had done their jobs. They had attended meetings. They had signed papers. They had taken lunch breaks. The horror was not in any single act, but in the system that made ordinary acts monstrous. The work of accountability has never really stopped. In 2015, the German authorities established a commission to investigate the fate of the Polish children who had been kidnapped during the war for forced Germanization. The commission identified dozens of cases where stolen children had been adopted by German families and raised as Germans, often without ever knowing their real origins. Some of those children, now in their 70s and 80s, were reunited with surviving Polish relatives in moving ceremonies covered by the international press. In 2021, a German court in Brandenburg convicted a 96-year-old former concentration camp guard of complicity in the murder of more than 3,500 prisoners at the Sachsenhausen camp. The verdict was significant because the man had never personally killed anyone. He had simply worked at the camp. The court ruled that being part of the machinery was sufficient for conviction. In 2023, the German federal government announced a new compensation program for Polish victims of Nazi persecution, recognizing that previous compensation efforts had largely excluded the non-Jewish Polish population who had suffered under the occupation. The amounts were modest by international standards, but the symbolic recognition mattered. And in 2024, the surviving fragments of General Plan Ost were inscribed in UNESCO memory of the World Register, the international list of documentary heritage deemed to be of universal significance. The fragments joined other Holocaust-era documents on the register, including the Anne Frank diaries and the Auschwitz concentration camp records. The inscription was not an ending. It was a reminder that the documents still speak and that listening to them is still a civic duty. So what do we make of all this? Almost a century after the men in the Berlin offices first wrote their numbers down, General Plan Ost was the most extensive demographic engineering scheme ever attempted by a modern industrial state. It was not a fantasy, not a metaphor, not an exaggeration by enemy propaganda. It was a real document produced by real people with real budgets and real timelines. The 31 million were not a rhetorical figure. They were a projection calculated by trained statisticians, approved at the highest levels of government, and translated into operational orders by mid-level bureaucrats who understood that their careers depended on producing the expected results. The plan failed. It failed because the people it was meant to erase resisted. They fought in regular armies. They fought in partisan units. They hid in forests. They smuggled children across borders. They buried their dead with full names. They kept their languages alive in private. They survived long enough to see the planners hang, or to testify against them in courtrooms, or simply to outlive them in quiet villages that the paperwork had promised would be emptied. The plan failed because the men who drew it up had made a fundamental miscalculation. They had assumed that human beings were units. They had discovered, the hard way, that human beings are stubborn. But the plan's failure does not erase its design. The planners did not lose because they were incompetent. They lost because the war turned against them, and because the people they meant to destroy turned out to be stronger than they had estimated. The blueprint remains. The numbers remain. The fragments in College Park remain. And they continue to do the work they were always meant to do, to remind us that paperwork can be patient, that bureaucracy can be murderous, and that a state which decides to treat its citizens as arithmetic will eventually produce an arithmetic of corpses. The 31 million were not hypothetical. They were people. They had names. They had languages. They had recipes. They had songs their grandmothers had taught them. They had arguments with their neighbors and bad dreams at night and favorite chairs by the window. The planners could put them in a column on a spreadsheet, but they could not put them in a grave without the rest of the world finding out what they had done. And the rest of the world did find out. It is still finding out. It will keep finding out as long as the documents survive and as long as there are people willing to read them. Thanks for sticking with this series, everyone. It has not been an easy subject, and I appreciate you spending your time on it. If this kind of long-form history resonates with you, the subscribe button is right there, and it really does help us keep making these videos. Drop a comment below with what you thought. We read everyone. Take care of yourselves, and we'll see you in the next one.